The crack split the earth at dawn, a wound so wide and so deep that Minnie Wallace could see the darkness beneath her own land like a secret the valley had been keeping for years. She stood at the edge of it, her boots at the very lip of the fissure, and she felt the world shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the ground and everything to do with the man standing 30 feet away, watching her with eyes that had gone cold as river stones. Edgar Boone held the deed in his hand. He held it the way a man holds a weapon he has not yet decided whether to use. "You knew," she said. "It was not a question." Her voice was steady in the way that only comes after a woman has already swallowed the worst of her grief and decided to be angry instead. "You knew about the spring. You have known since the moment you rode onto my land and offered to help me." He said nothing. The silence between them was its own kind of violence. The drought had been eating Sycamore Valley alive for 4 months. The creek had gone to dust in July. The topsoil had lifted in great ochre clouds and rolled east like the ghost of every dead harvest. 3 of Minnie's neighbors had packed their wagons and gone, surrendering their homestead claims back to the land office in Tucson, as though the desert had simply called their bluff. The valley floor had split and buckled and groaned, and the fissure that had opened in the night on Minnie's eastern quarter had revealed, in its terrible yawning mouth, the glimmer of something dark and cold and alive 40 feet below. Water. An underground spring, pressurized and ancient, hidden beneath limestone caprock for longer than anyone in Arizona territory had been alive to wonder about it. And Edgar Boone, who had ridden in from the north 6 weeks ago with a story about being a surveyor passing through, had been the one who told her about geological formations and porous limestone, and the particular way the soil had cracked in a pattern that meant something important was underneath. He had helped her. He had spent weeks beside her, measuring and digging and talking through the problem with an intelligence she had not expected from a man who looked like he had been carved from the landscape itself. She had trusted him. Worse than that, she had begun to love him. And now she understood that his employer, a land syndicate out of Phoenix called the Meridian Land and Water Company, had filed a competing claim on her eastern quarter, citing the underground water source as a mineral right that superseded her homestead patent. The deed in his hand was the counterclaim. "Minnie," he said, and the way he said her name, with something broken underneath it, told her that the truth was more complicated than betrayal. But she was standing at the edge of a crack in the earth that was also a crack in everything she had built and everything she had believed, and complicated was not something she had the luxury of feeling right now. "Get off my land," she said. He did not move. The sun was barely up and already the heat pressed down like a hand. The valley shimmered. Somewhere behind her, the windmill she had erected in May creaked in the small, dry wind, its wheel turning uselessly because there was no water left in the well for it to draw. That was the moment she had arrived at. That was the edge she was standing on. But it had not started there. It had started 4 months earlier, on a morning in early June when the last of the creek ran clear and cold for the final time, and Minnie Wallace knelt in the shallows and cupped the water in her hands and drank it and told herself it would rain. She had come to Sycamore Valley in the spring of 1887. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a mining engineer from Pennsylvania who had taught her to read geological surveys before she could ride a horse, and who had died of a fever in Denver in 1884, leaving her with a trunk of his books, his surveying instruments, a Brunton compass, and the stubborn certainty that a woman who could read the earth did not need to wait for a man to tell her what the earth was saying. She had filed her homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, 160 acres of valley floor in Maricopa County, Arizona Territory, the kind of land that looked barren from a distance but sang to her when she walked it, when she knelt and scooped the soil and felt the density of it, the way it held moisture 2 inches down even when the surface was dry. She had known in the methodical and bone-deep way that her father had taught her to know things, that this land was not dead. It was waiting. She had built her homestead in 6 months, not with hired help, because she could not afford it, but with her own 2 hands and the occasional assistance of her nearest neighbor, a widow named Clara Potts who lived 4 miles west and who brought bread and company every other Sunday. Minnie had built a single-room adobe house with a packed earth floor and a stone chimney, a small barn for her 2 horses, and the 3 goats she had acquired in a trade, a root cellar, and a garden plot that she had irrigated with careful bucket work from the creek. She had planted sorghum because sorghum was drought-tolerant, and because the soil surveys she had done on her own land told her that the topsoil was too thin and too alkaline for corn. She had planted a kitchen garden of onions and beans and squash in the shadow of the house, where the soil was richer. She had planted 2 apple trees in a spot where her compass readings and her father's old geology manuals told her the water table was closest to the surface. Her neighbors in the valley thought she was peculiar. A woman homesteading alone was unusual enough, but a woman who carried surveying instruments and talked about caprock formations and aquifer recharge rates was something else entirely. They were not unkind. They were simply baffled. Clara Potts admired her without understanding her. The men at the Sycamore Crossing General Store were politely skeptical, and then, when her sorghum came in September of 1887, better than any crop in the valley, quietly impressed. The drought had started in March of 1888. It announced itself as a dry spring, which was not unusual in Arizona territory, and then became a dry April, and then a May that offered 3 days of clouds and no rain and a cruelty of false hope, and by June it had settled over Sycamore Valley like a verdict. Minnie had watched the creek level drop with the systematic attention of someone who had been taught to observe before she had been taught to panic. She had measured it every 3 days, recording the depth and flow rate in the notebook she kept in the pocket of her work apron. She had cross-referenced her measurements with the geological surveys her father had made of similar terrain in Nevada in 1877. She had read every paper on hydrogeology she owned, and she owned more than anyone in the territory, because her father's library had been that particular and that generous. By July, when the creek was gone, she had already begun to form a theory. The theory was based on 3 things. First, the apple trees she had planted the previous autumn had not wilted in the way everything else was wilting. Their leaves were dusty and stressed, but they were alive, which meant they were finding water somewhere that her other plantings were not. Second, the eastern quarter of her land had a particular soil profile that she had documented when she arrived, a layer of red sandstone underlain by a band of light gray limestone that her father's manuals identified as a type associated with artesian formations. Third, in the section of the fissure that had appeared in the valley floor 2 miles east during a mild earthquake in June, she had observed a faint dampness on the limestone faces that was inconsistent with surface moisture. She had been planning to investigate that third point when Edgar Boone rode onto her land. He arrived on a Tuesday in late July. She was in the eastern quarter with her Brunton compass and her notebook, making a set of measurements she had been planning for 2 weeks, when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see a man on a tall bay gelding picking his way along the edge of the fissure with a carefulness that told her he was paying attention to the ground and not just to her. He was, she observed in the same methodical way she observed everything, a large man. Not merely tall but built with the solid particular density of someone who had done hard physical work for most of his life. Dark hair under a dust gray hat, a jaw that looked like it had been added as an afterthought to a face that was otherwise almost handsome. He had a rifle in the saddle scabbard and a revolver on his hip, and a set of saddlebags that were heavy enough to change the way the horse was moving under the weight. "You the Wallace claim," he called. "I am Minnie Wallace," she said, and did not put down her compass. He dismounted with the kind of ease that told her he had been living on horseback for years, and he walked toward her with his hat in his hand, which she noted because most men in the territory had not yet learned that removing one's hat was still a courtesy worth practicing. "Name's Edgar Boone," he said. "I'm working a survey circuit for the Territorial Land Office out of Tucson, routing new claim boundaries ahead of the expansion survey next spring. I was hoping you might allow me to water my horse and make camp on your claim for a night before I move on." His voice had a quality she recognized, the flat precision of a man who had been educated somewhere and had subsequently spent a great deal of time in places that did not reward the display of that education. She looked at him steadily. "You are measuring claim boundaries," she said, "but you are looking at that fissure." He glanced at the crack in the earth and then back at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not yet, more like recalibration, like a man deciding to stop performing a role he had prepared and to actually engage with the person in front of him. "The fissure is geologically interesting," he said. "I agree," she said. "I have been thinking it may indicate an artesian formation in the limestone below. I was making magnetic dip readings to try to locate the axis of the dome, if there is one." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a person hears something they were not expecting from a source they had not correctly assessed. He stared at her. She watched him stare and felt the familiar small satisfaction of recalibrating a man's assumptions. "You know geological survey methods," he said. "My father was a mining engineer," she said. "He taught me to read the earth the way other fathers teach their daughters to read the Bible. I find it more immediately useful." Edgar Boone looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the fissure. Then he looked at the Brunton compass in her hand. "May I see your readings?" he said. She could have said no. She was a careful woman, not given to trusting strangers. But the drought had been eating her alive for 4 months, and she had been working on this problem alone. And there was something in the quality of his attention, in the way he was looking at her notebook rather than at her, that felt like the specific kind of respect that comes from one technically minded person recognizing the work of another. She handed him the notebook. He read her notes standing up, flipping back through 3 weeks of measurements, and she watched his face go from cautious interest to genuine absorption to something that looked, unmistakably, like excitement. "These magnetic dip readings," he said. "You are measuring the deflection in the vertical component." "Your father's method. His modification of Schmidt's method," she said. "He adapted it for identifying water-bearing limestone rather than ore deposits. That is not standard survey practice." "No," she said. "It is better than standard survey practice." He looked up from the notebook, and for the first time since he had ridden onto her land, he smiled. It was a real smile, not the performed kind, the kind that happens when a person's face forgets to manage itself. "Your water table readings put the dome axis approximately 40 feet below the surface," he said, "in the eastern quarter, right where those apple trees are." "Yes," she said, "that is a significant finding." "I know," she said. He handed her the notebook back. He looked at the land, he looked at the fissure, he looked at her. "I am not just a boundary surveyor," he said. "I know that too," she said. He let out a breath. "No," he said, "I reckon you do." He stayed. Not for one night, as he had requested, but for the better part of 6 weeks, because the problem of reaching the water source, of diverting and capturing an underground spring that was 40 feet below the surface, without the kind of heavy drilling equipment that would require a contract team from Tucson and money that Minnie Wallace did not have, was a problem that neither of them could solve alone. What developed between them in those 6 weeks was not simple, and it was not slow. It was the kind of thing that happens when two intelligent, isolated people are given a shared problem that is both urgent and fascinating, when the work itself becomes the context for knowing each other. They worked from sunrise to midday, when the heat became dangerous, and then they sat in the shade of the barn and talked through the problem until the sun dropped low enough to work again. Edgar had knowledge that complemented hers in the specific way that two different kinds of expertise can combine into something neither could achieve separately. He knew percussion drilling and well construction in ways that her geological knowledge informed but did not replace. He had spent 3 years working for a water rights surveying company before his current employment, and he had helped sink wells in the limestone country of central Texas and knew the particular challenges of finding fault lines and following them. He knew her secret before she named it. Not the secret of the water, which they both knew, but the secret of her fear. She had built this homestead alone, and she had built it well. But the drought was a threat that her knowledge and her industry could not address without resources she did not have. She was 6 weeks from losing the sorghum crop entirely. If the sorghum failed, she would lose the income she needed to maintain her claim through the winter. If she lost the winter, she would have to abandon the land or take on debt that would effectively end her independence. The spring was not just water. It was the difference between survival and surrender. "Tell me about your father," Edgar said one evening, when they were sitting on the step of the adobe watching the sun go down over the western ridgeline in shades of copper and blood. "He was the most intelligent man I have ever known," she said, "and the least practical one. He could read a geological formation at 400 yards, but he could not keep accounts or manage money or navigate a social situation without making someone angry. He was better at understanding the earth than at understanding people." "Is that where you get it?" he said. She looked at him. "I understand people perfectly well." "I know," he said. "I meant the part about the earth." The way he said it, quiet and without any edge of condescension, settled something in her chest that had been restless for weeks. She was not accustomed to men who distinguished between her different qualities, who saw her as a person with multiple components rather than as a category. "He died when I was 23, she said. "He was doing a survey in the Colorado Rockies for a silver company, and he caught a respiratory fever and did not come down from the mountains in time." "I am sorry," Edgar said, and it was the simple kind of sorry that has weight. "After he died, I spent a year in Denver trying to find work that would use what he had taught me. But the mining companies would not hire a woman as a surveyor, regardless of my qualifications. A land office agent told me I would need either a husband or a different set of ambitions." She paused. "I chose a different set of ambitions." "The Homestead Act," Edgar said. "Woman can file a claim if she is the head of household or over 21. I qualified on both counts." She looked out at the land. "I knew what I was looking for. I spent 3 months reading territorial geological surveys before I chose this valley. The formation here is unusual. The combination of sandstone and limestone in this particular configuration, with the valley floor sitting above what I believed was an artesian basin, was something my father had documented as high-potential terrain." "You chose this specific land because of the water," Edgar said. "Not accusatory, just following the logic." "I chose this land because it was alive underneath," she said. "Even if it did not look it from the surface." He was quiet for a moment. The sky had gone from copper to deep violet. "I need to tell you something," he said. She felt the change in the air before he spoke it. "The company I am working for is not the Territorial Land Office," he said. "It is the Meridian Land and Water Company. They hold water rights in 4 other valleys in the territory, and they have been monitoring Sycamore Valley for signs of subsurface water for 2 years. They sent me here to survey the valley and identify any active or potential spring sources." The silence that followed was very long. "You were sent here to find what I already found," she said. "Yes." "And report it to them." "Yes." "And what would they do with that information?" He did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "They would file a mineral rights claim," she said, "under the interpretation that subsurface water is a mineral commodity separable from the surface land claim." She had read enough about water law in the territory to know this was contested but not impossible. "They would claim the spring and then charge me to access water on my own land." "That is what they intended," Edgar said, "before I arrived here." She turned to look at him. His face was turned away, toward the darkening west, and she could see the tension in the line of his jaw. "Before," she said, "and after." He turned to look at her. In the half-dark, his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. I have been working for Meridian for 18 months, he said. I told myself the work was neutral, that water rights were a legal matter and I was just a technician. But I have been in this valley for 6 weeks and I have watched you work this land and I have seen what this water means for you and I know what Meridian does to small homesteaders and I cannot pretend it is neutral anymore. What does Meridian do to small homesteaders? She said. They force them out, he said quietly. Not with guns, with lawyers and water fees and drought leverage. They wait until a homesteader is desperate enough to sell and then they offer a fraction of the value. I have seen them do it in 3 other valleys. His voice had a flat quality that was not absence of feeling but the opposite. I sent my survey report to Tucson 2 weeks ago. I told them the eastern quarter showed no promising water indicators. She stared at him. I lied to my employer, he said. To protect you. He paused. I wanted you to know that before it becomes relevant. Why would it become relevant? Because lies do not stay buried, he said. Especially not lies about water in a drought year. If Meridian sends another surveyor through, which they will find what I found. The fissure has widened since I arrived and the geological indicators are more visible now than they were 6 weeks ago. And when they find it, they will file the claim and the fact that I reported a false negative will be discovered. Which means you will lose your employment, she said. Yes. And possibly face legal consequences. Possibly, he said. Why? She said. Not skeptically, but with a genuine need to understand the logic of it. He looked at her for a long moment. Because what they are doing is wrong, he said, and because I have been allowing it for too long. And because I would rather be the kind of man who does not allow it than the kind who does. A pause. And because it is you. The admission dropped into the quiet air between them and did not dissolve. She did not answer it. She was not yet ready to answer it, but she did not look away. They had 2 weeks before the situation came to its head. 2 weeks in which they worked harder and faster than they had worked before, because the timeline had shifted and the stakes had clarified, and they both understood now that the spring was not just a solution to the drought. It was a legal and strategic fact that had to be secured before Meridian could claim it. Minnie had read every page of the Desert Land Act of 1877 and the Homestead Act amendments and the territorial water statutes that she could obtain from the land office in Tucson. She made the ride to Tucson herself, a 2-day round trip, and she returned with a stack of legal documents and a meeting secured with a land attorney named Hollis Crane who had a reputation for representing homesteaders against corporate claims. The key, she explained to Edgar when she returned, was the principle of prior appropriation, the foundational Western water doctrine that held that the first person to put water to beneficial use held the senior right to that water. If she could demonstrate that she had identified and begun the process of appropriating the spring before any Meridian claim was filed, she would have a stronger legal position. Identified is not enough, Edgar said. You need to have actually diverted the water, put it to use. I know, she said, which means we need to get to the water. The engineering problem was this. The spring was 40 feet below the surface in pressurized limestone. The fissure that had opened gave them a natural access point, but it was unstable and the walls were crumbling, making conventional well digging dangerous. The pressure in the formation meant that a properly positioned bore would cause the water to rise under its own power, creating a flowing well rather than a static one. But they needed to create a bore narrow enough to control, a casing that would contain the pressure while allowing water to be directed to the surface through a pipe or channel that Minnie could then use for irrigation. They did not have a steam-powered percussion drill. They had hand tools and ingenuity, and the particular quality of problem-solving that happens when 2 people have spent 6 weeks learning to think together. Edgar had in his saddlebags a set of hand-drilling tools that he had acquired over 3 years of well work in Texas, a set of star drill bits in graduated sizes, a driving rod, a hand sledge, and 30 feet of 2-inch iron pipe that he had been carrying since Tucson as standard survey equipment. standard for his kind of survey. Minnie had, in her root cellar, the waterproof cement compound that her father had used to seal core samples, a hand-operated rope-and pulley system she had built for lowering water buckets, and a precise understanding of where the dome axis of the artesian formation was located based on 6 weeks of measurements. "If we bore here," she said, kneeling at a spot 20 feet back from the main fissure using her compass and her notes, "we are directly above the apex of the dome at a depth of approximately 38 feet. The pressure at the dome apex will be highest here. The water will come up without pumping if we hit it correctly." Edgar looked at the spot. He looked at her notes. He picked up his star drill and turned it in his hands. "We drive the drill by hand to 38 feet, he said. "In limestone. That is 4 or 5 days of work if we are fortunate." "I know," she said. "And if we miss the dome apex by more than a few feet, we will hit the limestone shelf and the water will not come up under pressure." "I know that too," she said, "but I will not miss it." He looked at her with an expression that had not changed since she had handed him her notebook 6 weeks ago, steady and serious and fundamentally respectful. "I know you will not," he said. They started the next morning. The work was brutal in the way that August work in Arizona territory is always brutal. Heat that arrived before dawn and did not relent until after dark. Air that took the moisture from a person's body faster than labor could account for. They worked in shifts, one drilling while the other rested and drank the tepid water from the last of Minnie's stored barrels. The star drill had to be struck squarely or it would wander, and a wandering bore in limestone could miss the formation entirely. Minnie surprised him on the second day. She had watched him drilling for most of the first day, learning the rhythm of it, the angle of the strike, the rotation between blows that kept the bit from binding. And on the morning of the second day, she took the hand sledge from him without a word and told him to hold the drill rod while she drove. He accepted this arrangement with the slightly skeptical tolerance of a man who was being polite. He held the rod. She lifted the sledge and drove it with a precision and force that snapped his head up in shock. The blow was square. The sound of it was clean and true. She drove it again. Same angle, same force, same rotation after the impact that kept the bit turning and clearing. He stared at her. She was not a large woman. She was of medium height and lean and brown from months of outdoor work. And she was swinging a 12-pound sledge in a July heat that was already past 90 degrees. And she was doing it with the efficient economy of someone who had been taught the mechanics of striking and had practiced them. "My father," she said, without breaking the rhythm, "made me swing a hammer on every survey job he took me on from the time I was 14. He said that a surveyor who could not do physical work could not do accurate work." "He was right," Edgar said. His voice had a quality she had not heard from him before. She glanced at him briefly between strikes. He was looking at her with an expression that she could only describe as floored. Not the particular kind of male surprise that is actually condescension recalibrating itself, the kind that says how unexpected that a woman can do this. This was something different, something simpler. It was the expression of a man who had just encountered something he genuinely had not expected and who found it, in a way he had not anticipated, magnificent. She felt warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the heat. "Hold the rod steady," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was something in those 2 words that was different from the polite deferring they usually carried. They went down 3 feet that day. The limestone was harder below 20 feet, and they lost a drill bit to a flint seam on the afternoon of the 3rd day, which cost them 6 hours of work while Edgar hammered the broken piece free, and Minnie reground the edge of a backup bit on the whetstone she kept in the barn. The regrinding was another thing. She sat at the whetstone in the barn in the afternoon heat, working the bit with her father's precise angle guide that she had made from a piece of flat iron, and Edgar stood in the barn door watching her hands and said, slowly, "Where did you learn to dress a drill bit?" "My father," she said. "He taught you everything," Edgar said. There was no edge in it, just recognition. "He did," she said, Because he was afraid I would end up in a parlor somewhere being decorative. She paused, working the stone. He said the worst waste in the world was an intelligent person with nowhere to put their intelligence. Edgar was quiet for a moment. My father said a woman's place was to make a man comfortable, he said. I believed him until I was about 16 and met a woman who ran a cattle operation that was producing more beef per acre than any ranch in the county. And she was doing it by herself after her husband died, and she was not comfortable to be around at all. She was difficult and demanding and absolutely correct about everything. Minnie looked up from the whetstone. I was a cowhander on her ranch for a summer, he said. She scared me half to death, and I think I have been looking for a woman like her ever since without knowing it. A pause, until recently. She looked back at the drill bit. Her hands were steady. Hold that thought, she said, until we get this bit ready. I will hold it as long as you need, he said. On the fourth day, they hit the caprock. The bit dropped suddenly through a soft layer and then struck something that rang differently, not the dull thud of limestone but a hollow sound, like a stone thrown into a barrel. They stopped. They looked at each other across the drill hole. That is the void layer, she said. The pressurized cavity just above the aquifer. We are within 3 feet. He said nothing. He was looking at her with a focused intensity that made her want to look away and simultaneously made her completely unable to. Minnie, he said. Drive the pipe, she said. If we breach the cavity without the casing in place, we will lose control of the bore. He drove the iron pipe. She guided it. The work of seating the casing took the rest of that day. The pipe being set, and the space around it being packed with her father's cement compound to create a seal that would control the pressure. And as the evening light went amber and the desert began to cool, and the two of them knelt in the dust beside the bore with their hands gray with cement dust, and their faces streaked with sweat, the pipe began, gently and then with increasing urgency, to vibrate. Get back, Edgar said, but she was already calculating and she knew they had 20 seconds before the pressure found the gap in the seal, and she needed those 20 seconds to seat the valve cap that would control the flow. And so instead of getting back, she leaned forward and drove the cap home with 3 strikes of the hand sledge while the pipe shook with the force of water searching for the surface. The cap seated. The vibration stopped. The pipe went still. Then, slowly, the pipe began to weep. Water, dark with dissolved minerals, wept from the gap around the cap and ran down onto the parched earth. Minnie sat back on her heels and watched the water meet the ground. She had been expecting to feel triumph. What she felt instead was something closer to grief and gratitude combined, the particular emotion of a person who has been holding themselves together under pressure for a very long time and has just felt the need to hold relent. Edgar put his hand over hers. She let him. They sat beside the new well in the failing light and did not speak, and the water ran, small and dark and stubborn, into the dry earth of Sycamore Valley, and somewhere underground the ancient spring was moving, finding the opening that they had made for it, beginning the long work of rising. That was 3 days before the crisis. In those 3 days, she had opened the valve fully and connected it to the surface irrigation ditch she had dug the previous week in preparation, and the water had run east to her sorghum field, and she had stood at the head of the ditch and watched it go and felt something she could not name for a moment and then named it. Hope. She had constructed the simplest possible documentation of prior appropriation, a dated and witnessed record of the first water diversion, with Clara Potts riding out to serve as witness, and she had sent copies to Holly's Crane in Tucson and filed one with the county recorder in Phoenix. Edgar had sent a second letter to Meridian's Tucson office resigning his position, and then on the 3rd morning 2 men had ridden out from Tucson with the counterclaim, and Edgar Boone had been holding the document when she found him at the edge of the fissure in the early dawn, and the world had split open in more ways than one. She had said, "Get off my land." He had not moved. "Minnie," he said again, "I received that document by post yesterday. I did not write it. I did not file it. I told you I resigned. Meridian filed a counterclaim. You told them about the spring. I told them nothing after my false survey report, he said. But another surveyor came through this valley while I was at your claim. I saw him 3 weeks ago on the eastern ridge and I wrote him off, but he will have reported back. This document is the result of his survey, not mine. She looked at the deed. Her legal mind, the one her father had built, was already working through it. The filing date, the claim basis, the signature. Holly's Crane filed my prior appropriation documentation last week, she said. If their filing date is after mine, the counterclaim has no merit. Check the date, Edgar said. She took the document from his hand. Their fingers did not touch, but they came close. The Meridian claim had been filed on August 14th. Her prior appropriation documentation had been filed on August 9th. She looked up at him. I outfiled them, she said. By 5 days, he said. Crane will have it confirmed by the week's end. Under Arizona territorial water law, your prior appropriation claim will hold. She let out a breath that she had been holding since dawn. You knew, she said, different now, her voice changed. You knew the counterclaim was coming. I suspected it, he said, when I saw the other surveyor. I did not know the date. I was afraid. Afraid the date would precede mine. Afraid you would lose what you have built, he said. Afraid I had brought this on you by coming here, even though I changed what I reported. The morning sun was fully up now. The valley was brilliant and harsh and very still. Somewhere behind her, the irrigation ditch was running with spring water. You did not bring it on me, she said. They were already watching this valley. If you had not been the surveyor they sent, someone else would have come, and that person would not have walked onto my eastern quarter and seen what I was doing and decided to help me. He was still standing with his hat in his hand, the way he had been the very first morning. She saw now that he was holding it with both hands, the brim turning slightly, the only sign he was not as composed as he looked. I know I am not in a simple position, he said. I came here in a deceptive capacity and I left my employer, and I have complicated your legal situation even if the outcome is in your favor. I would understand if you wanted me to go. She was quiet for a moment. You lied to your employer to protect my claim, she said. You spent 6 weeks working harder than any man I have ever hired without any compensation. You drilled 40 feet of limestone by hand in August in Arizona. You drilled most of it, he said. I drilled half, she said. Do not minimize your contribution. He looked at her steadily. I also told you the truth about why I came here, she said, even when it was not safe to do so. That matters to me more than any of the rest of it. Minnie, he said very quietly. I am not finished, she said. I have been managing this land alone for over a year. I have solved problems that most people in this territory thought were unsolvable because I was too stubborn and too informed to believe they were unsolvable. I do not need rescuing. I do not need a partner who is going to manage me or minimize me or make decisions about my land without my input. I would never do that, he said. I know, she said. That is why I am saying the next thing. She paused. I have not been this close to someone in a very long time. Not since my father, and I am not easy to be close to because I am opinionated and relentless, and I will always have a geological survey in my apron pocket, and I will always have something to say about the composition of the bedrock. And if that is not something you can live with, then now is the time to say so. Edgar Boone looked at her for a long moment. His hat stopped turning. Minnie Wallace, he said, I have spent 6 weeks watching you read the ground like other people read books, and build a well with your own hands in conditions that would break most men and outwit a corporation twice your size using nothing but knowledge and preparation. And if you think any of that is a reason for me to leave, then for all your geological expertise, you have profoundly misread the man in front of you. She looked at him. Also, he said, I find that I cannot imagine a landscape without you in it. The thing that happened then was not dramatic in the way of stories. She did not run to him. He did not sweep her up. What happened was simpler and more honest than that. She walked the 30 feet between them until she was close enough to put her hand against his chest, and he put his hand over hers, as he had done beside the well, and they stood at the edge of the fissure in the full morning heat of Sycamore Valley with spring water running in the distance, and looked at each other with the particular intensity of two people who have decided to stop pretending they are not in love. He kissed her. She kissed him back. The valley was silent and blazing, and full of the smell of wet earth. The legal situation resolved as she had calculated it would. Holly's Crane confirmed the priority of her prior appropriation claim on August 22nd, and the Meridian counterclaim was dismissed by the Territorial Land Office in Phoenix in early September. The land attorney had used Minnie's own documentation as the central evidence, her precisely dated survey records, her bore logs, her diversion records, and the witness statement from Clara Potts, and had argued successfully that the spring was not a separable mineral commodity but an integral part of the surface land claim, given its use for agricultural beneficial purposes. Meridian's lawyers were not pleased. They sent a letter threatening a federal appeal. Holly's Crane sent a letter back citing 3 similar cases in which the federal courts had upheld prior appropriation against corporate mineral claims, and suggesting that the company might consider whether the cost of the appeal was proportionate to the value of a single artesian spring in a small valley. They did not respond after that. Minnie read the final confirmation letter 3 times, sitting at the table in her adobe house, with the morning light coming through the one east-facing window. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept her important documents, between the homestead patent and her father's copy of his survey notes. Edgar was in the barn working on the pulley system they were adapting to bring the spring water to the stock tank. She could hear the sound of his work, steady and unhurried. She sat with the silence for a moment. In the weeks since the morning at the fissure, things had changed and things had stayed the same. They worked together as they had worked before, with the same functional efficiency and complementary logic, but the edges of the work had softened. They ate dinner at her table. He had moved his bedroll to the barn loft, which was the appropriate arrangement for an unmarried man on an unmarried woman's claim, but they talked in the evenings for hours, on the adobe step or at the table, talking about the land and the water and the things they had read and thought about and the places they had been and the people they were. She learned him incrementally. He had been born in Missouri in 1856, the 3rd son of a farming family that had more children than land, and had moved the family west when he was 12. His education had been practical and self-directed, supplemented by a period of 3 years in which he had worked as a laborer for a St. Louis engineering firm and had read everything in the firm's technical library during the hours that the senior engineers were not using it. He had an engineer's mind that had never been given an engineer's credential, and this had shaped him in ways that were visible in the precise and systematic way he approached physical problems, and also in the quiet frustration that surfaced occasionally when he encountered the bureaucratic realities of a world that assessed capability by certificate rather than by demonstration. He understood her father's legacy in a way that no one else had. "You carry him with you in your work," he said one evening. "The methods you use, the way you approach a problem, the rigor of it, he is present in all of it." "I know," she said. "I used to find it painful and now I find it comforting." "When did it change?" She thought about it. "When I filed the homestead claim," she said. "When I came here and put his methods to use on my own behalf for my own land. He taught me to do things, but he taught me in the context of his work. It was not until I used his teaching for my own purposes that it felt like mine as well as his." "That is what inheritance is, maybe," Edgar said. "Not the having of a thing, but the continuing of it." She looked at him. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "A man less interested in ideas," she said. "Most men who work with their hands do not also think about what inheritance means. Most men who work with their hands do not spend their spare hours reading engineering texts," he said. "I am possibly an anomaly." "You are definitely an anomaly," she said. "So am I. Then we are compatible anomalies," he said. She smiled. It was the slow, real kind. In September, when the sorghum had been saved by the spring water and was standing green and thick in the field, while the rest of the valley's crops had failed, Minnie harvested. Edgar worked the harvest beside her, cutting and binding, and on the third day of harvest Clara Potts came with her teenage son to help, and spent most of her visit looking between Minnie and Edgar with an expression of transparent and unbridled curiosity. "He is not just a survey man," Clara said to Minnie when they were alone in the kitchen preparing the midday meal. "No," Minnie said. "He looks at you the way my Henry used to look at the cattle he was proudest of," Clara said. "Which is the highest compliment coming from Henry." "That is a very strange comparison," Minnie said. "I mean it as admiration," Clara said, "pure and serious admiration. He watches you the way a man watches something he has recognized as more valuable than he originally supposed." Minnie thought about the morning at the edge of the fissure, when she had taken the sledge from him and driven the drill bit, and the way his face had changed. "He was surprised by me," she said. "Good men always are," Clara said, without any irony. "And then they recover from the surprise and they stay surprised, which is the important part." The harvest came in at 240 bushels of sorghum from 100 acres, which was remarkable for a drought year, and which, when sold at the Sycamore Crossing market, gave Minnie enough to carry her claim through the winter comfortably, to purchase the materials for a proper pump assembly to formalize the spring well, and to send a payment to Holly's Crane that covered more than half his legal fee. In October, Edgar Boone took a position with a legitimate survey company operating out of Tucson, a small firm run by a man named Gil Everett who had known Edgar's work from his Texas years, and who had been looking for an experienced man who could do both geological and boundary survey. The work would keep Edgar in the southern Arizona territory for the foreseeable future, and would bring him through Sycamore Valley on his circuit roughly once a month. He told her this sitting across the table from her in the adobe house on a cool October morning with the smell of the coming autumn in the air. "Once a month is not very much," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it is not." A pause. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that the asking is not coming from any assumption about what you need or what you cannot do alone. You have demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that you can manage this claim, this land, and any geological or legal or engineering problem that it presents entirely on your own." She waited. "But I would very much like to be here more than once a month," he said, "and I would like to have reason to be." "Formal reason, if you are willing." The morning light lay across the table between them. Through the window she could see the eastern quarter of her land, the wellhead with the new pump housing, the sorghum stubble being cleared, the apple trees she had planted the previous autumn with their leaves going amber and gold. "Are you proposing?" she said. "I am asking if I may," he said, "which is different." She looked at him for a moment. "You may," she said. He proposed. She said yes. They were married in November of 1888 in the small Methodist church in Sycamore Crossing, by a minister named Reverend Abbott who had a reputation for performing services with efficiency and sincerity in approximately equal measure. Clara Potts attended and wept with a thoroughness that suggested she had been waiting for this outcome since August. Gil Everett, Edgar's employer, came from Tucson and brought a bottle of Kentucky bourbon and a wedding gift of a brand-new Brunton compass in a leather case that he presented to Minnie specifically, saying he had heard she was the better surveyor. Edgar laughed at this. Minnie accepted it without contradiction. There was no honeymoon in the conventional sense, because there was no money to spare for travel, and because neither of them was the kind of person who felt the need to mark an occasion with departure from the place they had chosen. Instead, on the evening of the wedding, they drove back to the homestead in the wagon in the cold November dark, and when they arrived, Edgar had lit the lamp in the window before they left that morning, and the adobe house was glowing faintly at them from across the valley floor, a small warm light in the enormous dark. "That is a good sight," she said. "Yes," he said. He helped her down from the wagon, which she did not need, and she accepted the help, which she had not always done, and understood that accepting it was not a concession of capability but a way of including him. Inside, the house was warm from the banked fire in the stone chimney, and the table had been set before they left, and there was a pot of stew that had been slow cooking all day, and the lamp burned and threw gold light on the packed earth floor and the shelves of geological manuals and the tin box with the important documents, and the surveying instruments hung neatly on their pegs. "I have been thinking," Minnie said, pulling off her coat, "about the limestone formation on the northern edge of the claim. The caprock profile suggests there may be a secondary artesian zone beneath the north pasture. If I run dip measurements through the winter, I should have enough data to locate it precisely by spring." Edgar sat down at the table and looked at her with an expression of complete and unironic adoration. "Tell me the theory," he said. She told him the theory. He asked questions. The stew was eaten and the lamp burned low and the wind came up outside and pushed against the adobe walls, and they talked until late, the way they had always talked, and that was the first night of their married life, and it was, in every way that mattered, entirely like themselves. Winter in Sycamore Valley was not brutal in the way of northern winters, but it was cold and relentless, and the work of maintaining the claim through the cold months was its own kind of labor. Edgar's survey circuit took him away for the first 2 weeks of December and the last week of January, and Minnie managed the homestead in his absence with the same efficiency she had always brought to it, though the house was quieter, and she found herself talking to the goats more than she had previously. When he came back from the January circuit, he brought her a package of books from a bookshop in Tucson, a new geological atlas of the Arizona Territory, and a copy of John Wesley Powell's report on the arid lands of the American West, which had been reissued with new survey data. She read both of them in 3 days and spent the 4th day explaining to him, with considerable animation, why Powell's conclusions about irrigation management in the arid West had profound implications for their spring management strategy. He listened to all of it. He asked the right questions. He disagreed with her on 2 points, and they argued those points with genuine rigor until she reconsidered one of them and maintained the other, and the quality of the argument was such that it felt more like thinking together than disagreeing. In February, she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this fact for 2 days before she told him, not because she was afraid to tell him, but because she wanted to understand what she felt about it herself before she brought another person into the conversation. What she felt was complicated and then, gradually, not complicated. She wanted the child. She had not known she did until it was a present reality, but she found that she did, in the same way she had found that she wanted the homestead, in the way she had found that she wanted Edgar, not as a need that completed something missing in her, but as a desire that extended something already present. She told him on a Sunday morning, sitting at the table with the winter light coming through the east window. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something softer than the steady regard she was accustomed to, something that was openly and uncomplicated overjoyed. "Are you well?" he said. His practical concern was characteristically the first thing. "I am well," she said. "I have been tired, but I believe that is normal." "Clara Potts," he said. "She would know." "She would," Minnie agreed. "I was planning to ride out and speak with her this week." "Minnie," he said, and stopped. "Say it," she said. "I am very happy," he said. "That is all. I am simply very happy." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "So am I," she said. Clara Potts, when informed, reacted with the comprehensive delight of a woman who had been hoping for this development for some time, and was now experiencing the satisfaction of correct prediction. She came to the homestead once a week through the spring, bringing practical knowledge about pregnancy and the frontier conditions of the territory, along with gossip from Sycamore Crossing, and the kind of company that Minnie, who was not by nature lonely but who was by experience accustomed to isolation, found herself grateful for. The spring work continued through March and April with modifications. Minnie was not willing to stop working her land, and Edgar, who understood her well enough not to suggest that she should, worked alongside her and managed the heavier labor with a matter-of-fact competence that made the redistribution feel like practicality rather than accommodation. She continued her dip measurements on the northern edge of the claim and by April had enough data to be confident of the secondary artesian zone. "Here," she said, on a mild April morning, pointing to a spot in the north pasture that looked identical to every other spot in the north pasture. 32 to 35 feet. The dome is smaller than the eastern one. The pressure will be lower, but there is enough water for the north irrigation channel. Edgar looked at the spot. He had stopped being surprised by her accuracy, which was in itself a kind of recognition. "When do you want to start boring?" he said. "May," she said. "After the spring rains, if we have any. I want to let the natural recharge cycle complete before we tap into it." "Practical," he said. "Also," she said, "I will be 7 months along in May and I would prefer to do the sledge work before then." He looked at her. "You are not swinging a 12-pound sledge at 7 months," he said. "I am aware of that," she said, "which is why I said May." He was quiet for a moment. "We could hire a hand," he said. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "I read in the Tucson Citizen that a man named Eli Rosen was looking for seasonal survey and well work. He came recommended by Gil Everett. He is apparently very capable." "I know Eli Rosen," Edgar said. "He is very capable, and also he will not minimize you, which I know is your concern." "It is always my concern," she said. "I will write to him this week," Edgar said. The Eli Rosen arrangement worked well. He arrived in late April, a quiet and methodical man in his mid-30s who had spent his career doing water well work across the territory, and who greeted Minnie's technical leadership with the respect of a professional recognizing another professional. He drove the drill rod on the north pasture bore, while Minnie guided and Edgar operated the casing, and they hit the secondary artesian zone on the morning of May 11th at a depth of 33 feet, almost exactly where Minnie had predicted. The water came up softer than the eastern spring, a gentle artesian flow that was ideal for the irrigation of the north pasture, where Minnie planned to expand her sorghum acreage. They cased and capped it and ran a surface channel to the north field, and by the time the work was done, the valley had had 2 decent spring rains, and the land was as green as Minnie had imagined it could be when she had first walked it in the spring of 1887. Eli Rosen departed with 2 weeks' wages and a standing invitation to return for the fall survey work that Edgar was planning for the western boundary of the claim. He shook Edgar's hand and took off his hat to Minnie and said, with sincere directness, "Mrs. Boone, your geological reading is the most accurate I have seen from anyone, professional or otherwise. That dome prediction was nearly to the foot. Your father trained you very well." She received this with the composed pleasure of someone who has always known their work was excellent and is not surprised to have it recognized but appreciates the recognition all the same. "He did," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Rosen." Their son was born on the 17th of July, 1889, in the adobe house, attended by Clara Potts, and a physician named Dr. Harlan from Sycamore Crossing, who had the reputation of being calm in difficult circumstances. The birth was not easy, as the territory had no shortage of ways to make things difficult, but it was successful, and by mid-morning of the 17th, Minnie was lying in the bed she had built with her own hands in the house she had built with her own hands, holding a son who was very loud and very red and very apparently healthy. Edgar sat in the chair beside the bed and held the baby while Dr. Harlan packed his bag, and the expression on his face was one that Minnie stored away in the same way she stored survey data, as something exact and irreplaceable. "He looks like you," Edgar said. "He looks like a newborn," Minnie said, "which is to say indeterminate." "He looks determined to me," Edgar said. "That may also be true," she admitted. "They named him James Robert Boone, Robert for her father." James Robert Boone was, from the beginning, a child of that particular frontier temperament that is neither easy nor manageable, but is deeply alive. He was intensely curious and physically fearless, and had, by the time he was 2, developed a habit of following his mother on her morning survey rounds with a stick he used to tap the ground as she did with her instruments, an imitation that was so accurate in its detail that Edgar watched it one morning from the barn door with a feeling so profound it sat in his chest like a stone. He told Minnie about it later. "He taps at the ground," Edgar said, "exactly the way you do. The angle is the same." "I know," she said. "He has been watching me work. He is 2 years old. He is observant," she said. "Children learn by watching. My father taught me that the best education is proximity to intelligent work." "What will you teach him?" Edgar said. "Everything I know," she said, and then more, a pause. "What will you teach him?" "Everything I know," Edgar said. "And to listen to his mother," she laughed. It was the bright, unguarded kind. The years that followed were not free of difficulty because the frontier was not a place that permitted complacency. The summer of 1890 brought a flash flood that damaged the eastern irrigation channel and required 2 weeks of repair work. There was a dispute with a neighboring claimant in 1891 about the boundary line on the northeast edge of the property, which Minnie resolved by producing her original survey documentation and demonstrating, with a precision that silenced the dispute before it could become a legal matter, that the line was exactly where she had always said it was. Edgar's survey work expanded, and he was away more often, though he managed his circuits to minimize the time in a way that his employer Gil Everett, who had become a genuine friend to both of them, quietly accommodated. Minnie, in the spring of 1891, was invited to contribute a written account of her artesian spring discovery to a new territorial geological survey bulletin being compiled by the University of Arizona in Tucson. She wrote the account in 3 evenings at the kitchen table, a precise and technically detailed description of her methods, her instruments, her measurement techniques, and her results. She included her father's modifications to Schmidt's method and credited him explicitly. The account was published in the Bulletin in the autumn of 1891. It was the first publication in the Bulletin authored by a woman. She received a letter from a Professor Aldridge at the University of Arizona who wrote with what was clearly genuine professional respect to ask if she would be willing to correspond regarding her methodology and whether she would consider presenting her techniques at a geological conference in Tucson in the spring. She wrote back that she would be glad to correspond and would consider the conference. Edgar read both letters. "You are going to the conference," he said. "I have not decided." "You should go," he said. "This is exactly what your work deserves." She looked at him. "James is 18 months old," she said. "Clara Potts will look after James," he said. "She has been asking to have him for a week for the past year. I will be in Tucson for the conference week for the county survey. We can stay at the same hotel and I will come to your presentation." She was quiet for a moment. "Edgar, Minnie, do not manage me." "I am not managing you," he said. "I am telling you that your work is important and that there is nothing in your situation that should prevent you from presenting it. That is not management. That is the same thing you would tell me." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "it is." She went to the conference. She presented her methodology in a room with 43 geologists and engineers, 39 men and 4 women, and she was the only person in the room presenting original field data from a small acreage homestead claim, rather than a corporate or institutional survey. She stood at the front of the room with her father's instruments on the table and her publication in their hands, and she spoke for 40 minutes in the flat, precise way of someone who knows their material completely and does not need performance to convey its value. The questions afterward lasted an hour. 2 of the questions were condescending. She answered those 2 questions the way she answered all the others, with exact and undeflectable technical content, and by the end of the session, the condescension had not so much been rebuked as made irrelevant. Professor Aldridge shook her hand afterward and said, with the directness of an academic who had been in enough conference rooms to dispense with false modesty. "Mrs. Boone, your adaptation of the magnetic dip method for artesian identification is more practically innovative than anything I have published in 10 years. I would very much like to discuss a formal collaboration." Edgar was standing at the back of the room. She saw him over Professor Aldridge's shoulder. He was not making an expression of encouragement or spousal pride. He was looking at her with the same expression he had worn on the morning she had first swung the sledge, the expression of a man who has encountered something he recognizes as magnificent and is not trying to conceal it. She smiled at him across the room briefly and returned her attention to Professor Aldridge. "Let us discuss it," she said. The collaboration with Professor Aldridge resulted in a jointly authored paper published in 1892 in the Journal of the American Geological Society, a paper that cited Minnie's field data and adapted methodology as the primary scientific contribution. It was not the last paper. Over the following years, as geological survey work in Arizona Territory expanded with the coming of larger settlements and the growth of Tucson as an administrative and academic center, Minnie Wallace Boone's name appeared in the professional literature with increasing frequency, always attached to field data of unusual quality, always carrying the footnote that her primary methods were derived from the work of her father, Robert Wallace, mining engineer, with her own modifications. She was not famous. She did not seek fame, and the profession had not yet reached the point of extending it to women who deserved it without a fight. She was not interested in fighting. But she was known in the circles where it mattered, and that was enough. The homestead grew. By 1893, they had expanded the sorghum acreage to 220 irrigated acres across both the eastern and northern fields. Edgar had left the survey company's direct employ by 1892 and had taken on independent contract work that he managed from the homestead, which suited both of them. They hired 2 hands seasonally, the reliable Eli Rosen for the spring survey work, and a young man from Sycamore Crossing named Thomas Hardwick for the harvest and heavy labor. And the operation had the comfortable efficiency of something that had been built correctly and maintained with attention. James learned to read geological surveys at age 5, which Minnie taught him at the kitchen table with the same patience and rigor her father had used. He learned it, she discovered, the way most things are learned at that age, which is to say by proximity and repetition, and the particular force of a parent's belief that the thing is worth learning. By age 7, he could identify 3 soil horizon types and knew the difference between sandstone and limestone by touch, which was more than most adults in the territory could say. Edgar taught him to ride and to track, and the practical mechanics of water well construction, the last of which James absorbed with a veracity that suggested he had inherited the same inclination toward underground systems that his mother possessed. In 1894, Minnie discovered she was pregnant again. This time she told Edgar the same morning. "I know this is complicated," she said. "The conference in Flagstaff is in March." "The conference in Flagstaff can be rearranged," Edgar said. "Or attended by correspondence if it cannot." "When?" "September," she said. "Then the conference is fine," he said. "September is a long way from March." "I was not asking you to make that decision," she said. "I was not making it," he said. "I was observing that the timeline is favorable. The decision about the conference is yours." She looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for occasions when he was entirely right and she had been prepared to argue unnecessarily. "Yes," she said, "it is." Their daughter was born in September of 1894, a girl they named Eleanor Rose Boone. Eleanor for Edgar's mother who had died the previous winter. Rose because Minnie had decided she liked roses and had planted 2 of them against the south wall of the adobe house in the spring, and they had bloomed red and extraordinary in a valley that was not given to flowers. Eleanor Rose Boone was, from the beginning, a quieter temperament than her brother, more observational and less immediately physical, with a stillness in her attention that both her parents recognized as something particular. She watched things. She watched her mother's hands when Minnie was using the instruments. She watched her father's face when he was working through a technical problem. She watched her brother's methods when he was doing things she had not yet been taught. James, for his part, received his sister with the complex and initially suspicious interest of a 5-year-old who had been the only child, and was not entirely convinced this was an improvement. But by the time Alina was 6 months old, he had assumed a proprietary tenderness toward her that expressed itself primarily in teaching her things she was not old enough to understand, explaining geological formations to her while she looked at him with wide, unrevealing eyes. The valley itself changed through the 90s. More homesteaders arrived as word spread that Sycamore Valley had a reliable water source, and the discovery of Minnie's eastern spring had, by indirect effect, prompted other landholders to look more carefully at the subsurface of their own claims, with mixed results. The town of Sycamore Crossing grew from a general store and a blacksmith to a proper small town with a post office, a school, a second general store that created a price competition that benefited everyone, and a doctor's office for Dr. Harlan, who had been practicing out of his home for too long. Clara Potts, who had sold her claim after the drought year and moved to Sycamore Crossing to run a boarding house, was universally considered the social center of whatever was happening in the valley, a role she occupied with the combination of genuine warmth and strategic information gathering that made her invaluable to everyone. Minnie and Edgar were dinner guests at the boarding house at least once a month, and the dinners were long and argumentative and full of the opinions of Clara's other guests, which tended toward farmers and traveling merchants, and the occasional mining engineer, passing through on the way to somewhere more obviously mineral-rich. Minnie found these dinners useful in the way that exposure to a wide variety of problems always makes a technical mind more flexible. Edgar found them entertaining in the way that a man who is genuinely interested in people finds any room full of people talking freely about themselves. In 1896, Edgar was offered a position as the lead surveyor for the new Maricopa County Agricultural Development Survey, a territorial government project aimed at identifying viable water sources for new agricultural expansion in the county. The position was based in Phoenix but allowed extensive field work, and it came with both a salary and a formal credential from the territorial government that recognized, at last, the combination of practical knowledge and self-directed education that he had been accumulating for 20 years. He turned it down. He told Minnie about the offer on a Sunday evening and told her at the same time that he had declined. She looked at him carefully. "Why?" She said, "Because Phoenix would mean 6 months a year away from here," he said, "and from you and James and Alina." "The work sounds important," she said. "There is important work here," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I did not ask you to turn it down," she said. "I know," he said. "You never ask me to limit myself, I know that. It should be your choice." "It is my choice," he said. "I am making it clearly and with full information. The work I do here, the surveys on this claim and the consulting I do for the neighboring homesteaders and the papers I contribute to your methodological research, that work has value that I would not trade for a government credential and 6 months in Phoenix." She looked at him. "Edgar," she said. "Minnie," he said. "I love you," she said. She said it directly and without preface the way she said everything. "I know," he said. "I love you too. That is a contributing factor in the decision. I will not pretend otherwise." "It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise," she agreed. "Yes," he said. The evening light was on the valley. The eastern quarter was green in a way that Sycamore Valley had not been before Minnie Wallace brought it water. The apple trees she had planted in 1887, now 9 years old, were bearing fruit in the autumn, small and somewhat tart and absolutely real, and the sorghum was standing and the stock tank was full, and the children were asleep in the back room, and the instruments were on their pegs, and the survey notes were in their box. He had written to the county office declining the position, and the letter was on the table, and she did not tell him he was wrong. The years that followed were the deep years of a life built correctly and inhabited fully. There were difficult seasons, as there always are in the territory, and there were repairs and disputes and illnesses that came and went with the particular cruelty of frontier medical limitations. A winter fever that put James to bed for 3 weeks when he was 8, and that aged both his parents visibly before he recovered. A prolonged legal dispute with a neighboring homesteader named Crumb, who claimed that Minnie's irrigation channel was diverting water from his surface rights. A dispute that was resolved in her favor after 6 months of legal correspondence, and a clear-eyed presentation of hydrological facts that left no room for interpretation. She and Professor Aldridge published 3 more papers together over the decade. The third one, in 1900, was cited in a Federal Review of Western Water Law that led to a clarification of prior appropriation doctrine that explicitly addressed artesian springs, a legal change that closed the loophole that Meridian Land and Water Company had tried to exploit on her eastern quarter 12 years earlier. Hollis Crane, the land attorney who had defended her claim in 1888, wrote to tell her about the Federal Review citation. She read his letter at the kitchen table with Edgar sitting across from her and said, with a quiet satisfaction that was entirely unlike smugness because it was earned, "It is closed." "What is closed?" Edgar said. "The loophole," she said. "The one that Meridian tried to use. The federal water law revision cites our case. It is closed for everyone now." He looked at her. "Your father would be proud," he said. She looked at the letter and then at the east window and the valley beyond it. "Yes," she said. He would. James left the homestead in the fall of 1906, when he was 17, to study geology at the University of Arizona in Tucson, where Professor Aldridge was by that time the department chair and had been corresponding with James for 2 years about his natural aptitude for the work. He left with his mother's instruments, a new set of notebooks, and a trunk containing his father's technical library, which Edgar had expanded considerably over the years. He embraced his mother at the wagon that morning with the slightly stiff intensity of a young man trying not to show how much leaving costs. She held on to him for a moment longer than he expected. "You know everything you need to know," she said. "Go find out what you do not know yet." He nodded, not trusting his voice. She stepped back and looked at him with her steady, exact regard. "Right," she said. "Every week," he said. "Monthly is fine," she said. "Accurate detail over frequency." He laughed, which was what she had intended. Edgar shook his hand and then pulled him into an embrace which was less composed and more direct. "Listen to her," Edgar told him quietly. "Even when you think you have the answer, listen first." James looked at his father. He understood what was meant. "I will," he said. Eleanor, who was 12, stood apart with her arms crossed and the expression of someone processing a complex emotional event through the mechanism of dignity. She did not cry until James was out of sight, and then she cried briefly and with great intensity behind the barn and came back with her face rearranged. Minnie found her there. "He will write," Minnie said. "I know," Eleanor said. "And he will be extraordinary," Minnie said. "Because he is your brother and he is James and he has had the best possible education." Eleanor looked at her. "Am I going to?" she said. "When I am old enough." "If you want to," Minnie said. "Where do you want to go?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Somewhere I can learn everything," she said. "Then we will find that place," Minnie said. That evening, after the wagon that had taken James to the Sycamore Crossing stage stop had returned, Minnie sat on the adobe step in the October cool and Edgar sat beside her, and the valley was quiet, and the stars were enormous over the desert, and the spring was running somewhere below the ground, constant and ancient and entirely indifferent to the human lives that had gathered above it. "Are you all right?" Edgar said. "I am fine," she said. "He is ready." "You made him ready," he said. "We made him ready," she said. He put his arm around her. She let him, which she always did, not as a concession but as a choice. the same choice she had been making since the morning at the fissure in August of 1888 when she had looked at this man and decided that he was worth the risk of trusting. "I have been thinking," she said. "You are always thinking," he said with affection. "I have been thinking about the western boundary," she said. "The soil profile out there has never matched the rest of the valley. It sits different. The density is wrong for the formation. I think there may be a third artesian zone, deeper than the other two." He looked out at the dark western edge of the land. "Where?" he said. "About 200 feet from the northwest corner marker," she said. "I want to run a full magnetic dip survey in the spring." "Tell me the theory," he said. She told him the theory. He asked questions. The stars moved. The spring ran. The valley was dark and quiet and alive underneath, full of water, full of old patience. They sat together until the cold drove them inside, and then they went in, and the lamp burned in the kitchen window for a while, and then it went out, and the house was dark against the enormous Arizona sky, ordinary and irreplaceable. The years after James left were years of a particular kind of fullness, the kind that comes when the urgent work of building is done, and what remains is the deeper work of continuing. Minnie's survey of the western boundary in the spring of 1907 found, as she had predicted, a third artesian zone at a depth of 61 feet, significantly deeper than the others, and with a flow rate that was lower but consistent enough to support the small orchard expansion she had been planning for the northwest corner of the claim. Eleanor, who was 13 by then, worked the survey beside her mother with a competence that went beyond imitation and into genuine understanding. She had been reading geology since she was 6, and had absorbed her mother's methods with a thoroughness that occasionally unnerved the men who encountered her in a survey context without being warned, as she had her mother's habit of speaking about the earth in ways that assumed far more technical preparation in her listener than most people in a frontier valley possessed. Edgar watched his daughter work and felt the same thing he had felt watching his son at 2 years old with the stick, the specific wonder of seeing something important about yourself continued forward in someone you love. "She is better than I was at her age," Minnie told him one evening, without false modesty. "Is that possible?" he said. "She has had a better teacher," Minnie said. He looked at her. "Her mother," he said. "Yes," she said simply. Edgar took Edgar's son's room when James departed for Tucson, and converted it to a drafting and correspondence space where he did his contract survey work, the desktop covered in maps and boundary descriptions, and the precise notations of a man who had learned to do his best work without formal credential, and had been doing it long enough that the credential had eventually come to him, in the form of recognition and reputation, and the telephone call in 1903 from the University of Arizona asking if he would be willing to serve as a guest examiner for the Geological Survey Certification Program. He had asked Minnie if he should do it. "Yes," she said immediately. "You did not think about it," he said. "I have been thinking about it since before they called," she said. He had agreed. The work at the university, 1 week per semester, had led to an association with the geology department that had in turn led to Edgar and Minnie being invited in 1908 to give a joint address at the American Water Works Association conference in Denver. The address was titled Field Methods for Artesian Spring Identification in Arid Limestone Terrain, and it was based on 20 years of data from Sycamore Valley and the methodological evolution of Minnie's original techniques. They stood at the podium together in the Denver Conference Hall in October of 1908, Edgar presenting the engineering and well construction components, and Minnie presenting the geological identification methods. And the audience of 300 water engineers and geologists was, for the most part, silent with the specific quality of attention that indicates that a room has heard something it will be thinking about for a long time. Afterward, a young man from the United States Geological Survey approached them with the directness of someone who had been waiting for this opportunity. "Mrs. Boone," he said, My department has been trying to replicate your magnetic dip modification for 2 years, and we cannot get consistent results. I believe the issue is in the angle calibration. Could you look at our protocol?" She spent 40 minutes with him going through his protocol and identified the calibration error in 12 minutes and spent the remaining time explaining the theoretical basis for the correct angle in terms that she had been refining for 20 years. Edgar stood at her shoulder through most of it, not adding anything but present, and when the young man finally left with a corrected protocol and an expression of wondering relief, Edgar looked at Minnie, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about it. They did not need to. They had dinner that night in a Denver restaurant with indoor gas lighting, and a menu that included things Minnie had not eaten in years, and they sat across from each other at a white-clothed table in the city where she had lived for a year after her father died, trying to find a place that would use what she knew, and she thought about that year and about the land office agent who had told her she needed a husband or different ambitions. "What are you thinking?" Edgar said. "About Denver," she said. "About the year I spent here after my father died. Tell me." She told him about the year, which she had told him before in parts but never as a whole, and he listened with his full attention as he always did, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you chose the third option," he said. "The third option. The one the land office agent did not offer," he said. "The one where you did not need a husband and you did not change your ambitions. You just found a different place to put them." She looked at him across the white cloth and the gas light. "You," she said, "are a deeply unusual man." "I have a deeply unusual wife," he said. "We are compatible anomalies," she said. He smiled, the real kind. "Still," he said. "Still," she agreed. They came back to Sycamore Valley in November, to the adobe house with its stone chimney and its geological manuals and its survey instruments and its 2 rose bushes against the south wall, now 14 years old and thick as rope, bearing in summer a quantity of red flowers that had surprised everyone, including Minnie, who had expected desert conditions to limit them, and found instead that roses and artesian spring water, given sufficient time together, could do extraordinary things. Eleanor was 14 and had, in their absence, managed the homestead with a competence that Clara Potts, who had checked in daily from the boarding house, reported with only minimally disguised triumph, as though Eleanor's capability was a personal credit to her. James wrote from Tucson that he had been taken on as a research assistant in the geology department and was working on a survey of the central Arizona basin formation that he believed would reveal a regional artesian system connecting several valley aquifers. He asked his mother for her original field notes from the Sycamore Valley surveys. She sent him the notes. She also sent a letter of 12 pages covering the methodological principles she thought most relevant to basin-scale artesian identification, with references to the papers she and Professor Aldridge had published, and 3 annotated corrections to claims she had seen in the most recent Geological Survey Bulletin. Edgar read the letter before she sealed it. "You are teaching him again," he said. "I have never stopped," she said. He folded the letter back and handed it to her. "Neither have I," he said. "It is what we do." She sealed the letter and they sent it south to Tucson, to their son who was doing the work. And the spring ran below the ground, and the valley was green, and the years stretched forward, unwritten and full of water. In the spring of 1910, James came back from Tucson for a month and brought with him a woman named Catherine Aldridge, the professor's youngest daughter and a botanist of genuine ability who had been corresponding with James for 2 years about the relationship between desert plant distribution and subsurface water presence. She was 24, sharp and quiet and very funny in the dry way of people who observe more than they perform, and she and Minnie spent 3 days of James's visit walking the claim together while James and Edgar worked on the pump assembly on the eastern well, which needed the bearings replaced. Minnie liked Catherine very much. She said so to Edgar on the 3rd evening. "She sees the land the way James sees it," Minnie said, "from underneath first." "Is that good?" Edgar said. "For a botanist, it is extraordinary," Minnie said. Most botanical study is surface and above. She thinks about root systems and soil moisture and subsurface chemistry. She is essentially doing geology from the plant side. She is good for James, Edgar said. Yes, Minnie said, she is. They were married the following year, James and Catherine, in Tucson, in a ceremony that Minnie and Edgar attended with Alina, who was 17, and spent the reception in conversation with one of James's fellow geology students, a young man named Frank who had the earnest and slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who had encountered Edgar Boone for the first time and was still recalibrating. Minnie noticed this from across the room and said nothing about it. Edgar noticed her noticing and said nothing either. They drove back to Sycamore Valley after the wedding with Alina between them on the wagon seat, and the October desert was gold and purple in the evening, and somewhere ahead of them the house was waiting, warm and lit, as it had been lit on the night they came back from their own wedding 22 years before. "Do you think James will come back here?" Alina asked, somewhere on the Sycamore Road in the dark. "Probably not to stay," Minnie said. "He has work in Tucson that will keep him there for years." "But he will come back. Will you miss him?" "I have been missing him for 4 years," Minnie said. "You learn to hold it alongside everything else." Alina was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking about the university in Tucson," she said. Minnie looked at her. "Tell me your plan," she said. Alina told her plan. It was detailed and practical and showed evidence of months of independent research, which was, of course, exactly what Minnie expected. Edgar listened from his side of the wagon seat with his hands steady on the reins, and the sound of the horses' hooves on the hardpan road, and the enormous Arizona night above them. And he thought about a morning in August of 1888, when he had ridden onto this land with a set of false pretenses and a survey kit, and an entirely incorrect idea of what he was going to find. And what he had found instead had been a woman reading the ground at the edge of a crack in the earth, with a Brunton compass in her hand and a theory about artesian water, and he had looked at her and felt the world recalibrate. He thought about all the years since then, the years of working beside her, of learning what she knew and watching her learn what he knew, of the children they had made and raised and sent forward, of the land that had been dry when they came to it, and was green now with spring water that she had predicted and found and brought to the surface with her own hands and his beside hers. He thought about all of it. "Edgar," Minnie said. He looked at her. She was watching him with the same direct and undeflectable regard that she had turned on him the first morning 22 years ago, when he had handed her the notebook back and told her she was doing something better than standard survey practice. "Where were you?" she said. 1888, he said. She understood immediately, as she always did. "A long way back," she said. "A long way," he agreed. "But a straight line to here." The wagon moved through the dark. Alina was asleep between them, her head on Minnie's shoulder, and the road was familiar, and the stars were their usual magnitude, and the valley was dark ahead of them with the light of the house, a small gold point at its center. "Do you regret it?" Minnie said, quietly, just for him. "Not a day," he said, "not a moment. Not the lie to Meridian," she said, "not leaving the company, especially not that," he said. "That was the first honest thing I had done in 18 months. She was quiet. "I have been thinking about the paper Aldridge wants to write," she said after a moment. "What about it?" "He wants to do a comprehensive documentation of all 3 artesian zones here as a model for valley water management across the territory. He has funding from the territorial government now." "That would make this valley a study site," Edgar said. "Yes," she said. "Survey teams would come through, students possibly." "You do not mind that?" "I mind nothing that brings the knowledge forward," she said. "My father always said that a discovery that stays in one place is only half a discovery." He looked at the road ahead. "The paper should have your name first," he said. "Aldridge is the senior academic." "The data is yours," he said. "The method is yours, the discovery is yours, the name should be first." She did not argue. "I will tell him," she said. "Good," he said. The house came closer. The light in the window held steady. Alina shifted slightly in her sleep and made a small sound and did not wake. Minnie's hand found Edgar's on the reins, not taking them, just resting there, the way a person's hand rests on something that has been constant. He turned his hand and held hers. They came home through the dark of Sycamore Valley, to the house they had built, and the land they had watered, and the life they had made from a set of instruments and a geological theory, and the specific and irreplaceable thing that happens when two people of equal stubbornness and complementary intelligence decide to be honest with each other at the edge of a crack in the earth. The spring ran below them in the dark, cold and patient, older than any of their years, feeding the roots of the apple trees and the sorghum and the red roses against the south wall. And the land was alive because they had seen it was alive before it showed it. And the water rose because they had found where it was waiting, and the valley was green and full and theirs. Aliner's plan was discussed the next morning at breakfast and approved unanimously and with genuine enthusiasm. She would go to the University of Arizona in the fall to study geology and natural sciences, and she would carry her mother's instruments and her father's library, and she would go into the world that her parents had spent 20 years preparing her for, and she would find what she did not yet know, and she would come back and tell them. The spring conference paper by Minnie Wallace Boone and Dr. L.G. Aldridge, with M.W. Boone as first author, was submitted to the Journal of the American Geological Society in June of 1910 and published the following January. It was reviewed in 3 subsequent geological publications and was cited, in 1915, in the Federal Bureau of Reclamation's Foundational Report on Artesian Water Management in the Arid American West. By then Aliner was at the university and already doing field work that her professors described, with the slightly dazed quality of people who have encountered a student of unusual capacity, as exceptional. James and Catherine had a son in 1912, named Robert for Minnie's father, and brought him to Sycamore Valley for Christmas of that year, and Minnie held the baby beside the stone fireplace with the geological manuals on the shelves and the survey instruments on their pegs, and the gold light of the lamp on everything. And Edgar sat across the room and watched her, and felt something so full and so specific that it had no name in any language but its own. Clara Potts, who had come for Christmas dinner, observed all of this from her chair by the window with the expression of a woman who has watched a thing grow from its beginning and knows exactly what she is looking at. "You built this," she said to Minnie quietly while the others were busy in the kitchen. Minnie looked at her. "We built it," she said. "You found the water," Clara said. "You found the man, you found the way through, you built all of it." Minnie looked around the room, the instruments, the books, the firelight, Edgar's hands on a cup of coffee, James and Catherine's voices in the kitchen, the baby sleeping, the valley outside dark and green and full. "My father taught me to read the ground," she said. "He said that everything alive is trying to reach the surface, that you just have to know how to find where it is." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He was talking about water," she said. "Yes," Minnie said, "and other things." The fire burned. The valley settled into its winter quiet. The spring ran below the frost line, constant and cold and entirely patient, waiting in the dark of the limestone as it had always waited, as it would wait long after all of them were gone, full of the water that the earth had kept for the people who were willing to look closely enough to find it. Minnie Wallace Boone put her hand against the warm adobe wall of the house she had built, and felt the ground beneath it, and was satisfied. Edgar looked across the room at his wife and saw, as he had always seen, the woman at the edge of the fissure with the compass in her hand, who had known what was underneath before anyone had dug a single inch, and who had been right, and who had built her life on that rightness with a precision and a courage that still, after 22 years, left him quietly astonished. He would tell her again tonight, as he had told her before. She would accept it as she always did, without false modesty and without deflection, because she was a woman who had learned from a man who loved her that accurate information should always be received accurately. And outside, in the cold dark of Sycamore Valley, the water rose.